Good evening, comrades, and welcome to the James Connolly Annual Festival. This evening we're going to talk about overcoming sectarianism, because there's obviously the ending of partition is at least again on the agenda, in spite of what Micheál Martin might be saying, a man who has forgotten that there's a need for public housing, a national health service, workers' rights, so we're not surprised that he has not noticed that the ending of partition may also be on the agenda or necessary. We're delighted here tonight to have with us a very excellent panel of speakers. And I'll introduce them just very briefly, and then we'll have a piece from each of them. On the right, and certainly not no inference meant. Gerald O'Mackle from Ardmagh, Gerald Mark Gray from Bandside Presbyterian Church, Kiva Neil-Lynchie from the Peadar Socialist Republican Forum, Jerry Carroll, People Before Profit MLA for West Belfast, and thankfully still the MLA for West Belfast. So that's our august lineup this evening, with which we're delighted to have them here this evening. And I expect to hear some enlightenment on this fraught subject of sectarianism. So I'm going to begin here with, and there's no sexist agenda by any manner of means, but we're going to begin with Kiva Neil-Lynchie. Kiva, maybe you could tell us this. Sectarianism, overcoming sectarianism, but sectarianism, is this a problem that affects the DNA of those of us born and reared in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland? Is it something that affects the water supply in the 6 counties? Or is there something else?
Well, the 6 counties is a product of colonialism and imperialism. It was established, it was colonised through the Ulster plantation. And the defining moment of the 6 counties, I believe, came as a result of the French Revolution, and then as a result of the United Irishmen movement. The United Irishmen of 1798 were not accepting of the planters, and they sought to unite Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. But this unity and this desire for unity challenged the British Empire. It's well known fact that the British agents at the time sought to reopen these wounds and to establish new wounds, and or to keep the green and the orange split. Sectarianism is not, as you said, Tommy, a genetic default. It's not a DNA problem. It's not something you're diagnosed with at birth. It's deliberately created to keep control, and to keep control, for the empire to keep control. And there were 2 organisations established in 1795, the Orange Order at Loughgall in Armagh and the Seminary in Maynooth, 2 highly sectarian organisations created not only to keep people separate, but to foster these divisions between people. And this was most important in the 6 counties, as that part of Ireland was most was important for the empire to hold on to at that time. It, over the next 100 years, this was cultivated, and this is where sectarianism overlaps with class culture. The fabric industry was growing in the north. There was now a need for a labour force. There was a need for linen mills, etc. And imperialist Britain and the unionist ruling class in the north had no interest in uniting people. It was more beneficial for them to keep people divided. They had to divide the people to stay favourable to the empire and to allow themselves entry into British economy, into Britain's economy, exports of linen and things like that. This division of the workplace was a tool used throughout the world. In Mississippi, it was dependent on the colour of your skin. In the Middle East, if you were female or male, or if you were on Star of David. And in Belfast, it's as to what church you attended on a Sunday. This unionist ruling class kept this division, and they promoted marginal privilege. So as long as the wages were not great, but as long as the Protestants had an extra couple of pence in their wages than the Catholics, they had the upper hand. They were having we're not talking Buckingham Palace dinners here, but they were having bacon for their breakfast instead of toast. As long as they were keeping the workers fighting among themselves, as long as they were keeping the Catholics fighting against the Protestants, they were preventing them uniting together and rising up and questioning the system. They were fighting each other rather than fighting why is the boss making more money in a month, in a day than we're making in a month. As I said, it's not a structural problem, it's not DNA, it's not genetic, and it was vital for these two groups, for the Empire in Ireland and the upper class to keep their power. It was vital for them to keep the working class divided. Before partition, the Royal Navy had access to ports all around Ireland, but after partition it didn't have this access, so it had to hold on to whatever small bit it had to hold on to the 6 counties. And this runs parallel with Unionists and the MOD, that they had to keep boots on the ground. But in the first 20 years of the 20th century, there's a number of examples of where they had problems with hegemony. For example, the strikes in Belfast, the engineer strike, the Caledon lockout. The Unionist ruling, they were afraid of revolution, and they had to keep these sectarian divisions alive. There was an example then in Caledon where the sectarian divisions briefly stopped in the face of a working class solidarity, but the Unionist employers again defeated that strike by playing the Protestants against the Catholics by offering them more money for less hours. As long as the 6 counties has existed, and as long as they do exist, sectarianism will exist. It's how they run the 6 counties. In the first 50 years of Stormont, they had to keep the people divided, they had to appease the Empire, so they introduced discriminatory bills with housing and voting, etc. By nature, people are decent human beings. They're not born to hate each other, they're not born to know whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Muslim. So they had to create this narrative. They had to create a lie to justify sectarianism. They had to promote the fact that, or they promoted the fact that Catholics were lazy, they had too many children, they didn't work, they were drunks, and of course the Catholic Church benefited from this narrative. As the situation now evolves, Britain is no longer the superpower that it once was. It doesn't have the same military strength, and it relies on the USA for a lot of its military aid. It's no longer strategic imperative to keep boots on the ground in the north. The ports are no longer of military's importance to them, and the 6 counties are no longer of military or economic importance to the Empire. The linen mills have gone, and the majority of businesses in the 6 counties are multinational corporations.
Sorry, could I just keep thanks for that. Just a few points maybe you could elaborate on. I mean, if we're talking about overcoming sectarianism in presumably a post-partitionist situation, how, if the material aspects brought about sectarianism, what do you believe should be done to maybe address or to begin to address the problem, which, as you've alluded to, I think, mentioning the Catholic Church, it's not one-sided, there's 2 players in this.
It's important that if we were to end it in the morning, that we need to be careful we're not left with the same situation as in the USA, where they're left with an alien, after deindustrialisation, they were left with an alienated working class, and as a result, Trump supporters. We have to be careful we're not left with a population who, if we join the failed health system and the failed system in the 26 counties, or we're left with what we have in the 6 counties, that they don't begin to actually believe that they were better off with the sectarian state that we currently have. We have to be careful that if we're left with the Orange Order, and we don't want to be left with a theocracy, we don't want to be left with a national maternity hospital being run by the church, the very same church that allowed young mothers, young unmarried mothers, to have their babies dumped in septic tanks and to be told how they should or shouldn't live their lives, and for us as women to be told how our reproductive system should be run by a bunch of men or women in the Catholic Church. So if it's a material problem, there's a material antidote, and the only way we do this is by creating a workers' republic and by having a healthcare system for all, free at the point of entry, to have a suitable, fair housing system for all, to have an education system that teaches the youth of today and the future how to teach the young children the right way of things, and to teach them how we all live together as Irish men, Irish women, and how we welcome people into Ireland, and how this is the only way we're going to remove sectarianism, when people understand that if we have the correct system for all, it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu.
Or even an odd atheist.
An odd atheist will allow them to.
Thanks, Keva. That's good. I'm going to ask Jerry Carroll, and Jerry has particular experience in Belfast, and I'm not trying to oversay what you're saying, but one particular nasty experience there during the election campaign, a comrade of yours, Hannah Kenny, was violently assaulted. But maybe you'd just give us your experience.
Yeah, thanks.
There's positives and negatives, I think.
Yeah, there is. Thanks, Tommy. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I suppose it goes without saying that sectarianism is the poison that obviously keeps workers and people on the side and divided, and is a daily obstacle for us on the left in terms of trying to fight and have a fair, just, equal society, and to dismantle capitalism, which I'm assuming people at this festival want to do. And even in the north, there's a daily occurrence of sectarianism, and Tommy touched upon Hannah Kenny's, our candidate's case, were basically attacked by far-right thugs under the guise of a certain ideology in the north. So I'll maybe come on that in a bit more detail, but that poses some of the challenges for the left. Maybe comrades in the south don't really come up against on a daily basis. So if the chair has me, I'm going to try and do three things. Try to situate sectarianism in today's society, briefly point to its origins, and attempt to outline a strategy to combat it. Again, if the chair, if I stray, chair, I'm sure you'll bring me back in the lane for time purposes. I think we need to cross the trade union movement and wider society here. Excuse me, an understanding and explanation why sectarianism emerged and why it continues to exist and persist today. I think we have to see the emergence of sectarianism, as Kiva said. That is inevitable, and that is something that was naturally going to always happen in this part of the world, or up in the north. It was something which has its roots in the interests in maintaining the interests of empire, and obviously the British Empire in its essence, and the partition and dividing of this island, and creating of a sectarian state in the north, and a conservative Catholic one in the south. Partition was a conscious political effort by Churchill, Bonner-Law, all these other people, liberals supposedly as well, to thwart the revolutionary change that was taking place across the world, but obviously on this island in particular. Not able to keep all 33 counties within the empire under the monarchy. It was thought it better to have 6 than nothing, better to have the industrial heartland of Ireland and the British Empire, rather than lose everything to a nationalist bourgeois revolution. So from the 17th century and before, right through the 20s, 60s and up until today, sectarianism was and is implanted from above by the British state and its defenders in the north, and chiefly historically the industrialists, employers and so on. Sectarianism was and still is used as a method to control wages, to keep them down, and as long as people were told in the north, as long as you have a job, because Catholics by and large didn't have any jobs or had unskilled jobs, it doesn't matter that you get paid less than workers in the Clyde, in Glasgow or in Liverpool or anywhere else in Britain. And every single time, and Kiva sort of touched upon this, every single time in the north, unity broke out in 1907, 1919, 1913, when workers came together. Sort of sectarianism didn't evaporate, but certainly it dissipated and was pushed aside. But continually, every single stage, every single step of the way, the state, through its propaganda machine and its use of armed bodies of men, through its state forces, whipped up sectarianism, tried to present every single struggle, even if it was quote-unquote economical, as a IRA front and a Bolshevik attempted takeover of the North as well. So every single step of the way that the Northern establishment, the British state, have fostered division and maintained the forces of division. Historically, that's been sort of forces like the REC, RIC previously, and obviously loyalist paramilitaries and gangs in a more recent form. In today's society, sectarianism lives on in many different guises, but one of the most pernicious is the idea that the other side are the problem. So if you live in a working class estate on the Shankle, you're told the reason why you're in poverty is not because of the inaction of Stormont and Stormont ministers on issues of wages and improving people's conditions, but it's because the people at the other side of the fence have got everything. And this obviously can be used by those same parties to try and blunt any criticism of their inaction for decades on these issues. It also appears that in particular unionist politicians are certainly in the driving seat in screaming about things like the Irish Language Act, the denial of Act Gaeilge, but some limited small investment in Irish language is a problem, and things like that are the reason why our health service is really in the gutter, rather than it being historically underfunded by, in particular, unionist health ministers historically. And historically, obviously, we've seen attempts by Carson in, I think it was 1920, the Fields of Finnegan, to lament the role of radicals in pushing for, changes to conditions in the workplace, but also wider issues. People who were called rotten prods. And saying that in the South may have a different connotation, and not even everybody in the North necessarily would know what that means. But rotten prods, I think, are an important group of people historically to look at, which basically are radical Protestants who were communists, who were socialists, who were people who were Connollyites, who were interested in labour politics, and so on and so forth. So today we're told by the likes of Jeffrey Donaldson, Jimmy Bryson and all these other people, essentially you've got people who are loyal to the Crown, to the Union, and you've got Lundies. That's all that there is according to those people in the North. But there's a real rich and radical history there that needs to be explored and touched upon. I think if we do some of that, point to those actions, those campaigns, strikes, industrial unrest of people, not only just for better wages and conditions, as important as that is, but also people who had ideas of Connollyism, who were fighting for a workers' republic in its earliest inception. I think if we do that, we have a chance of pushing back sectarianism. And I'll just finish up on a quick point here. I think the labour movement has a duty and a responsibility to ensure that it sees sectarianism as emanating from the quick places that I quickly ran through historically, but rather than seeing it as something natural or inevitable. And also I think it needs to see Stormont as an enabler and facilitator of sectarianism, especially in its solidification of the two tradition narrative, which everything is told is the only form of politics that exists, and that has cemented communalism right in the heart of every aspect of politics and life in the North. And unfortunately, with the surge in the likes of the Alliance Party, a sort of liberal, neoliberal political party, I think that surge is down to the absence of, I think, a critique of the trade union movement in particular, to critique Stormont's inaction, critique head-on the sectarianism, and obviously we've had an excellent strike wave recently which seems to be picking up again, but there's no critique in that from my perspective, our perspective, of Stormont and its parties. And the DUP does and says something sectarian, there's almost an attempt to wait around for nationalist parties to do something similar or something equally or on a level as bad as that, rather than saying DUP says something sectarian, we're going to call it out, we're going to challenge it head on. But just equally, and I'll finish on this final point, I think we also need a movement based on the trade union, based on the left, that also exposes, it doesn't equate unionism and nationalism, or it doesn't equate DUP with Sinn Féin on every single issue, but also has a left critique of Sinn Féin and points out when they have failed to do anything to improve workers' rights, failed to pass rent cap and reductions and actually voted against them and do some of that, I think we'll be on a good foot and hopefully then push back against sectarianism.
Just before I let you go, Jerry, maybe you could tell us the Alliance Party's role in that bill that you introduced.
Yeah.
I think that was critical. So maybe just for the sake of those that may not know, because anybody thinks the Alliance Party is a soft middle of the road.
Yeah, no, they're very much a party of the status quo and kind of the talk nice and fluffy on occasion, but they're very much a party of the historical establishment for 50 years, I believe. So we brought a trade union private members bill through Stormont because employment law is devolved to Stormont. Margaret Thatcher's anti-union laws are devolved to Stormont's books. No party, Sinn Féin, SDLP, Alliance or non-unionist parties attempted to change, amend or those bills and those laws out for Stormont's been up, on and off, but for the best part of 20 years since 1988. So I brought a bill to the floor of Stormont to oppose it. It was backed by the trade union movement, and the Alliance Party ultimately voted against it. They held the balance of power, and if they had voted for the bill, then it would have progressed and it could have been implemented. One of the last things that Stormont could have done, but their MLA Stuart Dixon got up and waxed lyrical. He should have been more alert to his plan, talking about how he was involved in the longest strike in the north and waxed lyrical about his trade union credentials, but then went to vote against it. So that's the short history of their vote on that, and I could bend people's ears all day about that, but still angry, as you can tell.
You can understand the things, right? Now we have with us the Reverend Mark Gray of Blandside Presbyterian Church, and as we could imagine, this is part of the proudest tradition we have on this island. There's no doubt about that, from the people that brought Republican democracy to this island, Mark Gray. And Mark, you have not only experienced the life in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, but you've also experienced life through your ministry in the United States and Malawi. And I think you can enlighten us on the evils of dividing people for different reasons. Thanks, Mark.
Hello everyone, it's really good to be with you. I feel that I kind of need to make a disclaimer first. While I am a Presbyterian minister, anything that I say tonight is not any official policy of the church. Because in some ways, just at the minute, I am a bit of a persona non grata within the church structures. But that said, I do want to say that the church has shaped me in every positive and progressive orientation that I have. So I want to own that. It has opened doors for me and windows for me, and I've generally walked through them or climbed through them and have grown through that. So I spent 6 years in Malawi and saw things from a post-colonial perspective with Malawian friends and colleagues. I've seen some of the best development work anywhere in the world in India. I had very close ties to the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, which is very small within that overall population. But the church has played a significant role in the struggle for democracy in Taiwan and to emerge from the longest period of martial law anywhere in the world in the 20th century. So one of my closest friends was an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience, taken away from his pulpit on Christmas Eve. He didn't see the birth of his second child, tortured, then released. Part of that whole democratic movement. Now, Tommy, you're going to have to stop me because I'm a preacher, and really all I want to do for you tonight is tell you stories and then talk to you about them. So there's that experience of Taiwan, Palestine as well, and another close friend is from Argentina. He came out of the Catholic Church after he taught Pope Francis as a young man, and got married, made his way in life, and was involved in the struggle for democracy in Argentina and for progressive politics. And he was telling me that there are roads in Argentina that he and his comrades will not travel on because they know that the bones of their friends and comrades are at the foundations of those new roads. Also spent time a number of years in the States. My wife is an American, and there came closer to the black experience, to exploitation of the poor, and to campaigning against the death penalty in America. So for me, at root, sectarianism is part of a pattern. And it's a pattern that takes different shape and emerges in different formations around the world. But you can kind of work out the coordinates. There's an idea of superiority and inferiority. There are some who are given privilege, and as Kiva said, sometimes within that structuring, marginal privilege, and then there are the disadvantaged. It operates by control and breeding a contempt of some sector in the community, the other. It breeds, it seems to me, an attitude of arrogance and of entitlement, but also, very interestingly, of fear and insecurity. And that is a danger within any kind of sectarian setup, because there's always the risk of violence that emerges from that fear and insecurity. So it operates by rivalry, suspicion, separation. Keep people apart in education, in workforces, and in all of the ways that you can. A lack of a shared space. There are barriers, not only physical barriers, but barriers of the mind. And it is, I think, in the Western world, it is rooted in a colonial ordering of us and them, of civilization and barbarism, of good and evil. And what you want is to pull someone into a group that identifies with a form of exceptionalism, because then you can bask in the shadow of all of that. So, to reference the States, one of my closest friends taught me this. He said, look, everybody can be prejudiced, but in the States, racism is prejudice plus the power to act on it. And if you read that across to Northern Ireland, sectarianism is that contempt of the other plus the power to act on it. And that is what was let loose, I think, in Northern Ireland. And people were shaped in that understanding of who they were. So we can all be prejudiced, but do we have the power to act on it in structural ways? So for me, sectarianism is baked in to the northern context. And in the big picture, the way to kind of move beyond sectarianism, or to begin to address sectarianism, is to change the context. I mean, I can speak about that. If you want me to pause at this point, we can come back to that, Tommy. I'm in your hands.
What I'll do is we're going to go into a Q&A, question and answer session, after we hear from our last speaker. And maybe that'll be an opportune moment to bring you in on that there, because we do want to talk about how to overcome sectarianism. There's some structural aspects to this, and there's educational aspects. There's no one magic bullet for dealing with sectarianism, something that's been baked into this.
mean, just to say this before we move on, my friend in the States will describe himself as a recovering racist. You know, he said that, you know, when it comes to this stuff of racism, and his analysis would be in the States at the minute, you're moving towards neo-slavery. You know, and the resurgent white supremacist movement. You know, and I think that here some of us may be recovering sectarian people.
Well, that's certainly interesting, because if we are talking about an end to partition, we want to say, will that bring an end to the different evils and where we're positioning ourselves? Our last speaker here now, Garrod O'Mackle, works in the ecclesiastical capital of Armagh. And I think Garrod, with that insight, will give us some valuable insights into the role of Rome, the Vatican, and Maynooth in contributing to overcoming sectarianism.
Not where I had intended to go, Tommy. It may shock you to find out that despite being immersed in the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, it hasn't had a great deal of influence over either my political or any other aspect of my life, with all due respect to those people of religious faith, of course. Tommy, I wasn't sure which way I was going to come at this, but I think I know now. I'm going to come maybe somewhat provocatively at it. I agree with everyone else. Sectarianism is a set of institutions. It's a particular form of political governance, and it's a peculiar but nevertheless indivisible form of class power. The origins of sectarianism lie in the British imperial system and its imposition of class power, its class power over Ireland, with its origins in that colonial subjugation. And sectarianism and partition, to me, they're almost one and the same, are lasting effects of British imperial support for partition in Ireland. And overcoming it is going to have to address who is perpetrating it, who is sustaining it, who's providing the material sustenance for sectarianism. If we're ever to overcome it, that's what needs to be addressed. Who profits from sectarianism? Who's making money and wealth from sectarianism? Go looking for them and you begin to find the answers and how it's overcome. The angle I'm taking, Tommy, well, I'll give you one or two. I mean, Kiva took us back to the 18th century, and that was the pivotal moment for sectarian establishment and concrete establishment of sectarianism, particularly in the north. Wolfe Tone once described sectarianism as the ghastly spectre of our distempered imagination. And his efforts to vanquish its ghoulish presence, obviously, as we all know, focused on uniting Catholic Protestant dissenter. That ultimately faltered, as Kiva pointed out, and give us some historical context to that, against sustained efforts by British imperialism to reconjure sectarianism again for its own purposes. So every time you got a United Irish movement, when Connolly and Larkin organised the workers in Belfast in 1907, in the Hungry 30s, sectarianism was brought by the powers that be into play once again in order to thwart the efforts of the mass of the people against their elitist rulers. Right, so I mean, it's clear that there can be no mistaking what sectarianism is about. However, in the north, it's beginning to take a different form, and I'm going to focus in on the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement and its role in the sustenance and sustaining of the sectarian system that operates currently in the north. There are powerful forces on both sides of the sectarian divide, but you know what I mean. That have a stake in maintaining a segregated society, rendering onto unionist elites things that are unionist, and more and more nowadays, rendering on to nationalist elites the things that are nationalist. Those of us who grew up in the nationalist community have watched it morph, particularly in recent times, and the emergence of new elites within the Catholic nationalist community, who we're going to have to keep a very close eye on, and we are already. Watch these New Ireland debates. Look who's behind these new citizenship initiatives and things like that. They're quite often the Catholic professional elites and business classes that are driving that agenda. And they will be, to me, the people we need to watch going forward very, very closely. Because it's in the direct, and I think Jerry touched on it, it's in the direct and compelling interest of the leaderships of both nationalism, centrist nationalism and unionism to reinforce communal loyalty as the basis of political allegiance. I mean, apart from Jerry and one or two noble other representatives during the election campaign, class doesn't feature. In fact, all the parties can stand up and tell you that they're going to improve the National Health Service, they're going to improve the education system, they're going to improve healthcare, they're going to improve jobs. The same people that have presided over increasing child poverty, lengthening waiting lists, a housing and homelessness crisis similar to what we have in the 26 counties we have in the north. Right? The people apparently, the same people, if we keep re-electing them, they're going to fix it, even though our experience is they continue to make it worse. So, and I mean, the obvious question is, why do people keep going back to them? Because that's the nature of the state, and that's why it's created. Because people will go back to tribal communal loyalties, and that will always trump class. As long, and Kiva said it at the very outset, as long as there's a Northern Ireland, there will be sectarianism, because that's its raison d'etre. So you're overcoming sectarianism. That poses the obvious solution.
Could I then ask you this, another question to lead on from that, with the sectarian division promoting class division in the north? Let's then take it a step forward. Is this compatible with the setup we have south of the border, that to prevent us ever having a united working class, which may in fact challenge the hegemony of capital down south?
Well, I think, Tommy, the purpose of the Belfast Agreement in some ways was about addressing that. I think the elites in Washington, in Brussels, in Whitehall and down the Marion Road, for their bit part in the formation of the structures around the Good Friday Agreement, are about moving capitalism on post-partition, yes, post-Northern Ireland, and to ensure that the current regimes and the current, what shall we call them, class relations are not disturbed by the removal of partition.
Yes.
Partition, yeah, I think a lot of people within unionism are beginning, to talk about when partition ends rather than if. And indeed, there are many sectors of society now talking about when it's going to end. I think the elites and the deep state have already preempted all of that. And you and I have talked before about the appointment of Drew Harris and things like that. I think they're manoeuvring already. They've gone past partitions.
And one final question by way of provocative question. We're talking here about the other side. We had Dan Winters' cottage and the Orange Order on one hand, we had Maynooth on the other hand. Maynooth, bear in mind, was funded and set up by the British government 30 years before the ending of, the introduction of Catholic emancipation. With the view, and one of the Catholic clergy remained a deeply reactionary element within Irish society to this very day. A bitter opponent of progressive republicanism, with the famous quote of eternity not being long enough nor hell hot enough for the likes of us. Okay, you know that. Does that influence still pertain?
Yes, and I take you back to the Good Friday Agreement. I'm going to sound like I have a bugbear, but I just think it's been missing so far to a large extent from the conversation. And to me, it has institutionalised sectarianism for several more generations, or as long as the North is going to last. And to come to your point about the Catholic elites, the GFA was designed to create a new sectarian political class, right? Both Catholic, Protestant, nationalist and unionist. And it was this middle ground that they were trying to reach, conservative Catholics and more middle-of-the-road Protestants and stuff, and bring them together. And the DUP and Sinn Féin were forced to change their politics entirely in order to get into that middle ground. In Sinn Féin's case, it now means support for EU imperialism and not talking about Shannon Airport and things like that. So finding their place within the imperialist superstructure. And they've had to move in there because that's where all the largesse is, in the middle ground, in the funds. That's where Europe and Brussels and America threw all the money at that in order to suck in what they call the extremes into centrist middle ground. And it wasn't hard to get the Catholic Church into that ground. It's, it was forever there. Bernadette comes up with a good one when they talk about the new power sharing structures in Stormont, and they've been lauded across the world as an international example of post-conflict best practice. But in a sense, you're creating new elites, and the rest of us are getting pushed further and further to the margins. Bernadette, when they asked her, well, what do you think of these new power sharing arrangements? What power? What sharing? With who? The people who never had any share of anything still have nothing. They're not sharing any power. They're not sharing anything at all. Things are getting progressively worse. Jerry will see it in West Belfast. It's just getting dire and dire as these middle-of-the-road centrist politicians continue on the neoliberal policies that were handed down to them by the Irish government and the British government. And indeed, that's what the architecture of the Good Friday Agreement was about, was to merge neoliberalism and sectarianism. Tommy, you know what's coming. Plug the book. Myself, Tommy, and several others.
I've been ambushed. Okay, right. Thank you.
More from the booklet.
Now, we're going to take a very brief break here. Stay where you are, because I think the organisers have a little collection to make of a bucket, I think. And in the best. So it's a free event, and it's just to see if we can help with the organising of it. Okay, while we're going to now go for a Q&A after the bucket has went round, and I'll take it one at a time. I want to make one announcement here, which I'll repeat at the end, but just in case anybody leaves a little bit early. Next Sunday at 3 p.m. in Arbour Hill, there will be the James Connolly annual commemoration. The main speaker is a Fermanagh man called Barry Murray, so if anybody is about, please come and feel welcome to attend. That's Arbour Hill, 3 o'clock next Sunday evening. And I'll repeat that at the end.
Come on, don't be actually shouting. It's the bloody dollar that's doing this. Only because they're building currency. It's not been like
The church collection.
Okay, yes, somebody has mentioned the church collection. Okay, now, I just want to say this, and I'll take this comment with a hand up. Please try and keep it within reason and be as polite as you can, because we have some very sensitive souls on the platform here.
I'm going to be polite. I'm Barry Ferguson from North Down in Newton Ards.
Oh, well, then that goes without saying.
Right in the heart of sectarianism. But I wanted to thank all the speakers. I thought you did an excellent job, very briefly and succinctly, of debunking the roots of sectarianism in Northern Ireland's problems, especially as we move forward towards a border poll and so on, thinking about it. But I think part of the problem is the education system doesn't teach about the recent past or the last few centuries, and it isn't integrated. And until we resolve that, we're going nowhere in Northern Ireland. We're going to have the same sectarianism repeat itself, and the middle ground parties, the DUP and Sinn Féin, just maintaining power and reinforcing neoliberalism. But my question was for Jerry. because you touched on rotten prods. I'm ethnically a Presbyterian, although I'm not a believer. I'm very much a socialist, and I have no options in Strangford constituency. People Before Profit hasn't yet got a group there. The unionist community don't have access to socialism, which is seen as your Workers' Party official IRA, your IRSP, INLA, your Sinn Féin provisional IRA, or your People Before Profit as a socialist party, an all-island socialist party. Are there any rotten prods actually in existence today? And where does somebody like me, where's my landing ground in trying to find that intellectual space where socialist values can be advanced on the unionist side of the community? I'm not a unionist at all. I'm a Democrat. I see it as an inevitability. Sorry if it was a bit long there.
Thank you.
Are there any rotten prods left?
Jerry?
Yeah, there's lots of them. Some in our party, not enough in our party. We're always looking more, but you see all the protests for marriage equality in the last couple of years. See all the protests for abortion rights in the north, north and south. You're seeing rotten prods and inverted commas on those protests. I think so you're seeing people moving, you're seeing people breaking from the shackles that they're told they have to remain in if they're born in North Down or North Belfast or wherever else. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of good breaking from that. I haven't read her latest book, but Susan McKay talks about some individuals who are kind of breaking from those kind of constraints, if you will. But I think what the task and the job of the left to do is to combine that in the political critique. So it's good that people are fighting back always. It's good that people are pushing back a Stormont in Westminster. But we need to develop in a, don't want to sound patronising, but in a non-patronising way, develop people's politics. So it's based on we want to get rid of the whole rotten system, because that is the defender of sectarianism, as people have said. So there's plenty of rotten prods out there, and we need to get more of them. But I think it's about teaching those lessons of history, as you say it, that aren't taught in schools, and to say your real allies are the people over that side of the fence, not the woman who's got a crown being driven into a open day speech at Parliament. So if we can do that, I think we'll get more, hopefully.
Okay, can I just then ask what could safely be described as a rotten prod? Perhaps. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I would.
Maybe elaborate on the point you made there about overcoming the issue.
Yeah, I mean, it was referenced there by way of comparison that we were having a church collection. Now, far be it from me to promote the ways of the Free Presbyterian Church, but I'm told that at a stage when Dr. Paisley was having a collection, he would announce that it was a silent collection, meaning that he was only interested when the bucket went round in folding money. Perhaps you'd want to at least entertain that thought. In answer to the question, I think that in the long view, we need to think about the nature of Presbyterianism and Protestantism in Ireland. And yes, we go to the United Irishman, and that is a wonderful example of something much more inclusive and radical and breaking down barriers emerging in this context, But on the 200th anniversary of the 1798 uprising, I heard a lecture by the historian A.T.Q. Stewart, who is essentially a conservative historian. And what he said, and this is the thing that I took away, was that within 10 years of the 1798 rebellion, the North was solidly unionist. So something had gone. So I've thought about that over the years, about why. There are various explanations as to why. I think one of them is kind of rooted in Protestant theology and a Protestant approach to life. And I want to talk about just a little bit about possibly the least known but most important Presbyterian that you've never heard of. And he's a man called Francis Hutcheson, who was a Presbyterian minister. And he taught moral philosophy in Glasgow University. He was born in 1695, I think. So he's just at the end of the 17th century. He influenced Adam Smith. He had really radical ideas. He was talking about the rights of animals at that stage. But he was part of a group, and they were interested in the Commonwealth, the idea of the Commonwealth. And I think that quite intentionally, they were picking up on the idea of the Commonwealth in the radical revolution in English history in the middle of the 17th century, with Gerard Winstanley and the Levellers and the Diggers and all of that, and they were beginning to domesticate it. The other part of that is that Hutcheson and phrases that Hutcheson used re-emerged in America, in the American Declaration of Independence, and that type of domestication of radical thought. I mean, you can reference as far back as Luther and Luther's attitude to the peasants' revolt, which wasn't very positive. And that whole idea of kind of a lack of willingness to embrace anything too radical, the need to domesticate and to keep in check. And I think that that will continue in the North until we kind of find a way to break out of that and allow different arrangements and different groups to come together and hopefully develop more progressive radical ideas.
Thank you.
But
Let me see, I just...
isn't it letting go? I mean, the most frustrating bloody nonsense in the 32 counties in 2022 is the conservatism, right? And the liberal mind. Oh, well, great that we accept women's right to women's right to actually choice, and rightly actually so. But the theology of this country, and sweet Jesus, may we be crucified. For keep on screaming. May we be crucified for keep on screaming. Where is the economic class social issues? What are you guys afraid of? Letting go of power or holding on to power? Where is your identity with the workers? When you look at a theology of Latin and South America, which I have read about and have been very much on the ball with, I would say, where the bloody hell is that in Europe or in the belly of the actual beast, America, where you had that radical, political, prophetic voice on the streets with the working class, and who wasn't afraid to say economic working class, who confronted the greatest terrorist state of the world, America. Where is that voice in the war against the Palestinian people, the people of Iraq and Yemen? And we on the left, in the next 3 years, and I say it again, we have learned damn all from the economic collapse of 2008. We have learned damn all from the wars of 2003, when we see Yemen, Palestine and Libya. Where is that prophetic Christian voice on economic class issues in exposing imperialism and the conservative right-wing bull that we listen to through the media?
Thanks,
Oh,
Colin.
you can call me an antichrist.
No, no,
I'll
no,
say
no, no,
crucify
no,
me.
no, 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 no. Order at the back there now.
All to the back, please.
Yes, please, yes. No, thanks, Colin. Did I see Paul?
Can I just ask a question for Jerry, because he's the one involved in legislation. I've had about 26 nephews and nieces, so when they were growing up, there was about 18 of them went to a Catholic school, 6 or 7 went to a county school, that was a dozen, and half a dozen maybe gone to an integrated school now. And for me, education empowers everyone, and yet the minute they were 4, they became involved in sectarian education. Yeah, it's a simple no-brainer. The question I want to ask you is, within the Stormont, Six County Stormont, whatever you want to call it, is there anyone who has, like, because from what I can see over the last couple of decades, Sinn Féin, O'Dowd and them have no interest in ending that whole cabal? And isn't one of the questions, one of the problems we have, with all due respect to the minister, is religion and how it's preached? So the question is about the legislation. Is there anything going to ever change in terms of the six?
Can we go ahead with that?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, good question, Paul. It kind of was asked by Barry in a way, but I kind of didn't answer it. There was an attempt by the Alliance Party in the last mandate to increase the provision of the term's going to my head. Cross community schooling. Integrated. Thank you very much. A teacher here as well. I think it's handy to have integrated education, and I mean it was good in a way because it brought the issue up on the floor of Stormont, but it was very timid and very limited. So we obviously had one and have one MLA myself from our party. But during the debates, we were kind of, making the point that, people should be obviously educated together. That's a positive thing. That's a good thing. But also, we shouldn't have the religious ethos on their schools. People religious have no odds or qualms, but they should have no role in saying what the curriculum is. So now, obviously, we have the Catholic schools and the sort of state maintained schools, but you have the ethos, the religious ethos. So why is my class, when I was in second or third year, need to be told that abortion is immoral and is a sin in an all-male grammar school? That's not relevant to what we need to know or should be taught or anything like that. So there's a bit of a move towards integrated education, and the bill passed, and I think ultimately is a good thing, but it's limited, and all through the conversation, sort of unionists were losing their minds, thinking that the religious ethos of schools are going to go. But the Alliance Party, the proposal of the bill was kind of saying, actually no, this is maintaining religious ethos. So I think that's a part of the Department of Education Act of whatever year needs to be amended. But apart from ourselves, there's no real move to kind of tackle that and just safely integrated education, which is good, but it's not far enough in our view because it still maintains the two traditions of the main divide, and it's kind of learning from the traditions rather than kind of saying, listen, how do we learn about this radical history, and that's a question for and everything else, I suppose, as well.
Thanks,
Hope that answers your question.
I just want to expand on this issue a little bit. Gerald wishes to come in, and I'm going to ask Keith a question as well. Gerald?
Yeah, just because we've had some recent experience of this, Paul, and to the other comrades. I work in the Irish language sector in Armagh. We've just built a new Culturland, and high on the success of that, we attempted to set up an independent, non-denominational Irish-speaking school in Armagh, which is a new trend as well. It's a very welcome trend, particularly in the Irish language sector, that will the policy of Cordian na Gael Scoileachta, which is the body overseeing the development of Irish medium education in the 6 counties, their policy is to build non-denominational schools. They're integrated, I suppose, in the common parlance, schools. However, our biggest enemy and the biggest block on the development of that sector is the Catholic controlled maintained sector. Now, there's an obvious fear from the point of view of teachers in the Catholic controlled maintained sector, the English-speaking sector, part of that sector, that with the phenomenal growth, it has to be said, of Irish medium education in the 6 counties, that there could be a threat to the employment of a lot of English-speaking teachers. And you can see it manifest itself on the ground. When an Irish medium school starts, it immediately starts to suck people out from the English-speaking schools. So there is that threat. However, I don't think that's the main motivation behind the Catholic-controlled sectors attempt to stop us. And they do everything in their power to stop us. When we went to build, we were on the cusp, we had a site, we were going to build an East School, Bund School on this brand new site, and we had the funding, we had everything for it. The bishop and the priest got all the local principals, school teachers together in the great and good of Catholic society. They had several meetings down in the Armagh City Hotel. We managed to get people close enough to them when they were speaking to hear what they were on about. So what came back was there'll never be a non-denominational school as long as we're here. So they created a couple of extra spaces because there's a burgeoning pressure on the existing Irish medium schools. So we had the numbers behind us as well. We had everything lined up, all our ducks lined up in a row before we went at it. We had all the numbers. However, they just increased slightly the capacity of the Irish medium schools. There are 4 or 5 Irish medium schools in Armagh City alone. They increased the capacity of those to take a couple of extra pupils into each, and that's to, I suppose, close off the fact that there was excessive demand for existing places. And even more interesting one, sorry for taking up your time, but myself and Tommy were approached a few years back, before the pandemic, by teachers in the Moy primary school. And Tommy described me as being from Armagh. I was reared just the far side of the Moy, in Tyrone, and grew up and went to a Catholic school in the Moy village. And the teachers from that very school that I attended, Kiva attended, Tommy, did you go to the St. John? No, you were college now. In Armagh, just to get him back. But that particular primary school, there was a proposal, and I think it emerged from Good Friday Agreement and all this, the Dixon Plan, was to create some new school. A new school in Enniskillen. They had a big site in Omagh. The significance of Omagh, I suppose, was post-Omagh bomb and all that. You know, they were going to develop this big new school. And the Moy. And the Moy, probably for similar reasons. You know, the Moy would be pretty well known in East Tyrone and the Murder Triangle and all that spate of sectarian killings that took place there. So they had targeted 3 projects. The one in the Moy was to wasn't to integrate the 2 schools, it was to take the 2 existing primary schools, the state school or Protestant school and the Catholic primary school, and bring them together on one site, but not integrate them.
Co-education.
Yeah. Tommy, you came out with a great phrase. Anyway, there was a public meeting in the parochial hall, and the great and the good, the parish priest, the MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone were there. But the school teachers had approached me and Tommy several weeks before the public meeting and asked could they join the Independent Workers' Union. And we said, why? Because there are proposals to change our school. We have not been consulted. This has all been done at a level. So we have over 200 years of teaching between us in the school, and none of us have ever been asked about any of this. And what are the proposals, Tommy and I said? That they build a new building and they bring the Protestant school keeps its uniform, the Catholics keep their uniform. They use separate doors and separate entrances on this one site. And everything except measure between their eyes as they come in the morning to see which assembly they're going to, you know, it was just crazy. Separate but equal, Tommy, I think was the phrase you threw at them.
Well, it was, I think it was even more grit than that.
There was more.
I described it as apartheid.
But the parish priest jumped up, myself and Tommy made a speech on behalf of the teachers and said it was disgusting. It hadn't worked in the southern states of America, it hadn't worked in Alabama, hadn't worked in South Africa, apartheid. You know, why are you bringing it to the Moy in the 21st century? It hasn't got a great record, apartheid, you know, anywhere for that matter. The parish priest jumped up onto he was first up to the pulpit and said the bishop will never allow an integrated school in this village. That was his exact words. So we can stop talking about any form of integration. It's not going to happen. This is as good as it's going to get. They'll be able, some of them might play it together in the corner of a yard, you know, at some stage, or something nice like that. And that was that until the MP for the area stood up and closed out the discussion. All this fancy talk about, and we know who the MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone is still the same, it hasn't changed, I don't think, stood up and said, that's all fine and fancy talk about integration, but people just aren't ready for it yet. the MP informed us. So could we stop talking this fanciful theoretical nonsense and get back? This is as good as it gets, more or less. Sorry, Tommy, that was wrong.
I'm going to shortly bring this to a conclusion, but just one point I'd like to make. It was made to me a number of years ago by Bernadette McCalliskey, that about the only concession made to the broadly, if you like, Catholic community by the old Stormont regime of Craig and Andrews and Carson was to give to the Catholic hierarchy in the 6 counties charge of the education system for Catholics. And of course, in return, the Catholic schools were in the hands of the Catholic clergy to continue to keep a division. And as a result of that agreement, the only concession made by the old Stormont regime was to the education system, to give the Catholic hierarchy control over the Catholic education system. And in return, of course, the Catholic hierarchy made no comments whatsoever about the nature of society in the 6 counties. As I said to me, the investment in 1785 was probably one of the best investments the British state ever made. Right, can I have another question, please? Right, sorry, let me see, there's a number of questions here, right? Can we keep them fairly brief now because we're running out of time? For this community at the front, the glasses.
I was wondering, how would you be able to, how do you think that you'd be able to convince working class people in the north for reunification, given that that would be giving up the National Health Service for and the education in Northern Ireland for the equivalent services currently present in South?
Okay, do you want to propose? Could I get a number of questions here? Sorry, see if I'll take you from the front to the back. This comment here.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Jerry was saying. There was an interesting thing that happened during the election before and after. Was there's been quite a significant strike wave in the north, which really hasn't been commented enough on at all. And it's in very stark contrast to what's going on in the south, where mainly because of social partnership, actually, the unions have done nothing in response to the cost of living crisis. Okay. Now, Irish people for profit too. Our view is that these issues are resolved through struggle in the main. We're not simplistic about it, clearly. We believe by getting people to fight together, you'll be able to break down these divisions. But I think always in the north, the question is the state always intervenes in the sense, But I wanted Jerry to comment maybe just on the impact of this strike wave at all in the election, and because it looks to me, and I haven't had enough time yet to absorb fully the outcome of the election, it seems to me that middle class people are more prepared to cross the divide by voting for the alliance, whereas working class people seem less inclined to do so at this point.
Thanks. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Comment here. Can we all keep them brief?
Yeah, it's just a great question. What can we do in the Republic of Ireland to help overcome sectarianism in the north? What role do we have? Like, as I know I have an American accent, but I'm an Irish citizen.
Fine. No, we're not. I've seen right. Second from the bottom, and then I'll comment to Jimmy, and that'll be it. Yes, yourself. Go ahead.
Quick question for everybody here. Are there any positive developments you've seen from single issue campaigns, for instance housing, LGBT rights, the environment and so on, that could provide a basis for cross-community progressive politics going forward?
Thanks. Finally, is it Jimmy?
Yeah, I suppose it follows on there from Connolly, from people for profit in the sense of strikes and industrial action in the north, and the defeat of the Trade Union Freedom Bill by the Alliance Party, and the Green Party didn't turn up. And the question is the trade union movement in the north, and Jerry touched on it as well about the marriage equality and abortion rights for women. The labour movement in the north are willing to go so far as united struggle is concerned, but they're not willing to tackle the root cause of the problem, which is British imperialism, which keeps the two communities divided, because there are only two classes. They keep going on with two communities, but there's two classes, and one is keeping the other class divided for 100 years. But the trade union movement seems that they're grand, they go for abortion rights, they go for marriage equality, but mention British imperialism, it's a no-no. When the shipyard was on strike here a couple of years ago, and it was occupied, they wanted, and United Union were looking for British military contracts. And what we're actually doing in the shipyard at the time, we're building turbines for green energy. So they ignored the actual work that they could have done there to done some good in the world. Instead, they wanted to produce British military ships to go around and cause mayhem all around the world. So when is the trade union movement, particularly because it's the largest group in the 6 counties and in the south of the working class, when are they going to tackle the real class issue? And that's the British colonial state of the 6 counties of the North world.
Okay, thanks. Right, we're coming to a conclusion here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the speakers to conclude. Now, with the permission of the speakers, Jerry, 2 questions have been addressed to you. Do you mind if you...
Yeah, well, I'll go.
You've got them...
Unification and then strike wave. And
yes, the strike
wave. I was thinking a third one in there.
Last question.
Yeah, the comment asked about NHS, I mean, I suppose... obvious point is the NHS wasn't a gift, you know. I mean, it was brought about by fear of revolution after the Second World War. You know, given reform of the one revolution, one of the Tory ministers, I think, said at the time, if that's who it was. So in terms of the unification question, I think we want to frame the need to have an NHS type system, call it that or call it something different if we want, but a funded, publicly run health system, north and south across the island, and if we can insert that into the conversation about Ireland, I think it would be potentially a game changer, and comrades and people before profit and others probably here involved in the All Ireland 32 county All Ireland NHS campaign now. And I think things like that are important initiatives to try and have a conversation to say, listen, we actually, what we want to do is to extend the principles of the NHS across the island, but also excuse me, and the fact that it's not just in the south, in the north we've got a ridiculous 2-tier health system where people can get treated relatively quickly if they're on if they're able to pay privately, whereas if you're not, you're waiting 6 years to see a consultant. There's over 500,000 people on a waiting list, so insert the principle of a publicly run health system into the conversation for United Ireland is the quick answer. I know it's a bit more complicated than that. In terms of strike wave, yeah, I think the answer to Eddie's question, you know, had a bit of an impact on the elections in a sense that, you know, we were on the doors and people were asking us, well, we were leading with the fact that workers were being forced to take strike action because they're being having their pay cut and they're being offered a below inflation pay offer by Storm ministers, so it had an impact at a grassroots level, but at a main lowland BBC level, not really. It should have done, because there's been just a week of the election, there was a strike involving several thousand council workers, housing executive workers, education workers as well. There was due to be a TransLink strike the week of the election, but that was postponed. It's now happening next week. I think if that had happened, that would have had a much more lightning effect because society would have ground to a standstill, but it's obviously heating up, and in some ways if it had happened before the election, we might have got a few more Socialists in the storm, but maybe that's just my wishful thinking. Just the final question with the trade unions from I think it was Jimmy, was it on the back? Yeah, I think there's a fundamental weakness of the trade union movement across the island, but I think in the north in particular. Call it British imperialism, absolutely, but also to kind of confront loyalism, and that they equate loyalism equals Protestant, loyalism equals Protestant worker, because that's I think a myth that some of the trade union movement in the north perpetuate and believe. And just one concrete example, I mean, last summer we had a summer where there was riots in the Shackle, essentially led by Jamie Bryson and people that got stuck in the fire over the protocol. As far as I can recall, happy to be corrected, but the trade union movement organised absolutely nothing in response to that. People before profit, not to toot our own horn, but we organised an online rally because of COVID and all that kind of stuff. If they had came out, the trade union movement said Protestants, Catholics, Americans are sick of this kind of stuff, we would have had a lightning effect. We would have had thousands of people out or online, depending with COVID, but they refused to do that because there's a particular problem, I think, in challenging the nature of, you know, that reactionary aspect of loyalism in particular. And the positive developments, that's a common question. I think the repeal referendum was probably the most positive development in terms of radicalising people north and south, and I think it's we're still a while away in terms of having the conversations about abortion in the north, but there's certainly been a radicalised core of activists, and I think they can be one to watch more things, including Connolly vision of a workers' republic. Sweet talk.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Kiva, can I ask you to comment on your final speak here? Possibly again to address the question of our comrade here at the front, the question of how would you address people in the north that have experienced at one stage a useful National Health Service, albeit seriously declined over, seriously damaged over the last number of decades, but what would you do to address that and other issues that might prove attractive to people in the north?
Well, coming from the north, if we were to join the 26 counties, we're not really giving up anything beneficial when we say we're giving up the NHS, because waiting lists are that long. Children are waiting. As a teacher myself, I'm seeing children waiting 3-4 years to be diagnosed. Their parents can't get them into doctors, they can't get appointments with their GP, so they're paying £60 to these private clinics that are popping up. And as Gareth mentioned earlier on, a lot of them are now nationalist upper class now that are setting these private clinics up, and particularly in my own area of the Moy. And so we're not really giving anything up by giving up the NHS. We're not giving anything up by we're not losing a decent education system, because our education system is a sectarian system. So the 26 counties need to reassure the north, I suppose, by creating a suitable public housing system, workers' rights for all, an equal education system, a health service that's free at the point of entry for everybody. And in reality, as it stands, we don't want to join that. We don't want to stay in our NHS system either. So we need to create our own system, a system that's fair for all. And the only way we'll do that is by joining, by keeping the left together, by having nights like this, and by joining the likes of the Peadar Forum. I think that's...
That's a plug for that, but who's your entitled to it? Right. Gerald, I'm going to jump here. Can I ask you to sum up there? Perhaps, you've heard the questions. Maybe that the comrade here with the American accent, or the Irish lady with the American accent, the role for the Republic of Ireland in bringing, what role is there for the Republic in advancing the end of sectarianism? How could they help that?
Okay, I think there actually is an opportunity, and Sinn Féin floated it just after the election. Mary Lou MacDonald called for a citizens' or assembly, and I mean there was talk in the Good Friday Agreement of a civic forum, which got off the ground for a little while. But even during its limited tenure, it was an opportunity for other voices outside the two big sectarian camps to come in and have their voices heard. I think if we make those citizens' assemblies on specific issues, I think we need all islands citizens' assemblies, by the way, to talk about housing. We need an all-island citizens' assembly to talk about a new health service, an all-island health service free at the point of delivery. We need a housing, a homelessness emergency citizens' assembly. And Tommy, if that was initiated, I think, by either the Irish government or actors within the 26 counties, and invite six county representatives to that. I'm not talking about political representatives, I'm talking about trade union leaders. The trade union movement is still the biggest working class social movement in the island. It is a potential reservoir of new power, and something that we could take into, citizens' assemblies. We could use the trade union movement to push a new left discussion and agenda about how this new Ireland's going to look, because at the moment it's looking like it's going to be pretty much the same. And I'd like to finish, unfortunately, it looks like the new Ireland's going to be pretty much the same as the one that we're living in now, the way things are shaping. But I'm not entirely pessimistic about that, it must be said, and I'd just like to congratulate Jerry, because I know the sectarian cauldron that parts of the north of Ireland are, and you cannot get above that or beyond that agenda quite a bit of the time. For Jerry to hold his seat in what effectively became, is it going to be a Catholic or a Protestant Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, essentially what that election turned into, and for Jerry to hold his ground, I'd like to say brilliant. And just to end with Comrade Connolly behind us, I was reading, speaking of his time in Belfast, which you know he spent quite a bit of time in, where he was very successful up to a point, when he endeavoured to organise Catholic and Protestant workers along principled anti-imperialist lines. To bring it back to Jimmy's point, I mean, James Connolly didn't put a tooth in it when he was organising workers in Belfast. So he was forced to concede, even James Connolly, that it felt as though he was promoting a 20th century revolutionism amidst the mental atmosphere of the early 17th century. I'm sure Jerry could his echoes of that on his campaigning trail, and that's often what it does feel like when you're pushing a Marxist agenda in the 60s.
Thanks, Gerald. Now we're going to have to round up something that Mark here is going to round up, and it just strikes me, that republicanism, left republicanism has been introduced to this island effectively by community, the Presbyterian community. I think the other thing that strikes me is that there's a deep factionalism within republicanism, contentious, tendency to argue, disputatious, and I often wonder, Mark, has it anything to do with the founding fathers?
Oh, I think it probably does. I think it probably does.
Anyway, sorry for that. The floor is yours, James.
I think it probably does. Let me wind up and say it's been great to be with you tonight. When I was doing some research, there was a quote by a friend to some of you, I'm sure, Antonio Gramsci, who said, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, there arises a great diversity of morbid symptoms. I think that for me, that kind of sums up where we are in the north and perhaps across the island. But like Garoj, I'm not completely without hope, because I do think as I look at Northern Unionism, there are shifts. And I think, and this is something that I've thought about kind of over the last 20 years as I've come and gone, and lived different places, lived 8 years in Donegal, that deep, deep down, pretty much every Unionist loyalist knows in their guts that things are changing. And I think that can be managed. I think that there's a space for what you might call personal generosity, listening to stories about why people are the way they are. And so many of the conversations that we have are kind of futile and futureless. And by futureless, I mean they don't go anywhere. And I think that we can have conversations that are more engaged, that create spaces, that have that personal generosity, but there needs to be a kind of a structural framework. And I would love it if in my lifetime we had that structural framework, perhaps emerging from some sort of process that says, okay, this is our agreed direction of travel. And we have a democratic mandate for that. And then I think that you release forces that are kind of presently tied up in sectarianism and in no future. And with a reference to a guy called Benedict Anderson. And you may be interested in it for a number of reasons. Benedict Anderson had some roots in Ireland. He was a political scientist and anthropologist, and he did all of his primary work in Indonesia, and was kind of there in Indonesia doing his primary research when the change from Sukarno to Suharto happened, and from your point of view, the third largest communist party in the world was literally decimated, with upwards of 1 million people slaughtered, and more is coming out about that. And Anderson opposed that and wasn't able to return to Indonesia for a long time. He, in one of his books about nationalism, said that nations are imagined communities. And I think that in Ireland we have kind of had distorted, deformed, negative, suspicious imaginations. And I think that if we're able to reach a stage where we have a direction of travel, and I do think that Ireland and the south of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and even the Irish government has a role in that. I mean, I think that for me, that the kind of the elites in the Republic will do all that they can to avoid any of those hard conversations about where we're really going. And we need to have those conversations and move forward. So I do have that degree of hope that that will happen, maybe in my lifetime.
Thank you, Warren. Could I just ask for a quick round of applause for these four speakers? You don't want to give ideas.
Courageous.
You don't want to give Just finally, can I just repeat the fact? The annual James Connolly commemoration, which will bring it to an end, the James Connolly Festival, it will be at 3 p.m. on Sunday evening, Arbour Hill, and the principal speaker will be from Anoman, Brownway. So please, if anybody can spare the time, come and attend. So safe home, everybody, and thanks for attending, and thank you to our four speakers.
Thank you.